Dennis said nothing. He was doing the math in his head again, the way he had every night for 3 weeks. 3 children, 1 estate, and a mother who'd spent her final 2 years in a room that smelled of bleach and loneliness because none of them had room in their lives, or so they'd said, for a woman who'd raised them alone after their father died. He pushed that thought down. It didn't matter now. What mattered was the folder sitting in front of Samuel Voss. Thick with the weight of everything his mother had owned, Voss was younger than Dennis expected, maybe 45, with steady gray eyes that moved over each of them in turn before he opened the folder. There was something careful in the way he did it, something that made Dennis's stomach tighten just slightly, though he couldn't have said why. "Before I begin," Voss said, "I want to note for the record that Margaret Holloway was of sound mind when this document was drafted and revised, most recently 8 months before her passing. She met with me 4 times, alone." "Alone?" Patricia's husband repeated, frowning. "Why would she need to come alone?" "That was her preference," Voss said simply, and didn't elaborate. Wayne shifted in his seat. "Can we just get to it? No offense, but it's been a long few months." "A long few months." Dennis almost laughed. Wayne had visited their mother twice in her final year, both times during the lunch hour, both times leaving before the aide came to help her eat. But none of them said that out loud. They never said it out loud. They'd built an unspoken agreement among themselves, a kind of fortress of selective memory, where they were dutiful children who simply lived busy, modern lives, and their mother understood, because mothers always understood. Voss cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Then let's begin. This is the last will and testament of Margaret Ann Holloway, dated and properly witnessed, superseding all prior wills and codicils." Patricia reached for her husband's hand. Wayne sat up straighter. Dennis folded his own hands on the table, steadying them, and told himself this was finally, after everything, going to be the moment his patience paid off. He had no idea how wrong he was. Voss began with Dennis, reading from the page in a calm, even voice. "To my son Dennis, who told me on the afternoon of my 76th birthday, and I quote, 'Mom, don't worry about leaving me anything big. I just want something to remember you by. Like your old recipe box that's sentimental. The money doesn't matter to me. I leave my recipe box and the recipes within it in full." For a moment nobody moved. Then Dennis let out a short, confused laugh. That's a nice gesture, but obviously that's not literal. That's just an example of the sentiment, right? There's more after that." Voss looked up at him, not unkindly. "There is more. But that is the entirety of your direct bequest, Mr. Holloway." Patricia's hand tightened around her husband's. She was next, and Dennis watched the color drain slightly from her face as Voss turned the page. "To my daughter Patricia, who told me in the hospital parking lot last spring, and I quote, 'Mom, I don't need anything from you. Honestly, I'd be happy with just something small to remember you by. Maybe your wedding ring. I leave my wedding ring.'" "I was being polite," Patricia said, her voice climbing. "People say things like that. It's a figure of speech. It doesn't mean." "I'm only reading what was written," Voss said. Wayne had gone very still, sensing what was coming before his name was even spoken. Voss found the line and read it without inflection. "To my son Wayne, who told me over the phone 2 Christmas ago, and I quote, 'Take it easy, Mom. I'll just take whatever's left after everyone else picks. No big deal. I leave him whatever remains after the specific bequests above are honored.'" The room had gone quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of 3 adults realizing in real time that every careless, performative word of false humility they'd ever offered their mother, words meant to sound generous while they angled for more, had been recorded somewhere, remembered, and now turned back on them with surgical precision. "This is insane," Wayne finally said. "This isn't a real will. This is a joke." Voss closed the folder halfway and looked at all 3 of them. "I assure you, Mr. Holloway, your mother had never been more serious in her life. There's one more section. I'd suggest you let me finish." Voss opened the folder back to its full width and pulled out a single typed page separate from the rest, clipped with a small gold paperclip Margaret must have chosen herself. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that Dennis noticed it. A tightening around the eyes of a man who had read this section before, privately, and still wasn't entirely prepared to read it aloud. "This next portion," Voss said, "is addressed directly to the 3 of you in your mother's own words. I'll read it as written." He cleared his throat once more. "To my children, Dennis, Patricia, and Wayne. I want you to know that I was not confused, and I was not careless when I wrote what came before this. I remembered every word you ever said to me, Because in the last 2 years of my life, when I sat alone in that facility on Cedar Lane, words were sometimes all I had. I remembered the calls where you discussed in front of me on speakerphone because you forgot I could hear how much I was costing each of you in time and money. I remembered Thanksgiving when none of you came, and the only person who sat with me, who fed me, who held my hand when the pain was bad, was a woman none of you ever bothered to learn the name of. Patricia's husband shifted uncomfortably. Wayne's jaw had gone tight. Her name is Lupe Fernandez. For 4 years, she was my hands when mine stopped working, my voice when mine grew tired, and my family when my family had better things to do. 3 years ago, I quietly transferred the house, the lake property, my savings, and the trust your father left behind into the Margaret Holloway Foundation for Forgotten Elders, naming Lupe as its director and sole beneficiary, so that other mothers like me are never left the way I was left. Voss paused here. The room had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that has weight. There is one more line, he said quietly, and his voice, for the first time all afternoon, caught slightly. He looked down at the page, and Dennis saw his hand still for just a second before he read the final sentence, the one that would later be the only thing any of them could remember clearly about that day. I gave you exactly what you asked for. I only wish, just once, you had asked for me. No one in the room said a word. It was Patricia who broke first. A sound caught somewhere between a sob and a gasp, her tissue finally serving its purpose. Wayne stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. This isn't legal. She wasn't in her right mind. She had to have been manipulated, that woman clearly. Or Mrs. Holloway passed 2 independent competency evaluations, Voss said calmly, sliding 2 more documents across the table. Both administered within the same week as her final visit here. I'd encourage you to read them before you say anything else about Ms. Fernandez. Dennis didn't stand, he didn't argue. He sat very still, holding the small wooden recipe box that had been placed in front of him, running his thumb along its worn brass hinge, the same hinge he remembered from childhood, the same box that had sat on the kitchen counter every Sunday of his life. Filled with cards in his mother's handwriting, he realized, with a kind of quiet devastation, that he had been handed the only thing in that room that was actually, truly his mother, and he had asked for it as a lie. 3 weeks later, Lupe Fernandez sat in the same conference room, hands shaking, as Voss explained what the foundation now held in her name. She wept before he finished the second sentence. I didn't do it for this, she kept saying. I did it because she was kind to me. She asked about my children. She remembered their names. The foundation opened its first satellite office that winter in a modest building 2 miles from Cedar Lane with a brass plaque mounted beside the door. It funded in home caregivers for elderly people whose families had quietly stopped showing up. People like Margaret, who had spent her last years counting ceiling tiles and waiting for a phone call that came less and less. Dennis visited the plaque once alone. On a gray afternoon almost a year later, he read the inscription slowly, the way he imagined his mother had wanted someone someday to read it. I gave you exactly what you asked for. I only wish, just once, you had asked for me. He stood there a long time, recipe box tucked under his arm, before he finally turned and walked back to his car. Not forgiven, not absolved, but for the first time in years, honest with himself about exactly what he had lost.